In a small, secluded village nestled deep in the heart of war-torn Europe, the world of its inhabitants had been irrevocably altered. What had once been a place of laughter and light, where children ran barefoot through sun-drenched meadows and families gathered in the evenings to share warm bread and stories, was now a place of silent dread. The air was thick with the lingering scent of smoke from distant bombings, and every corner of the village seemed to carry the weight of unspoken fear. The sky, once clear and open, now often appeared clouded with ash and the heavy traces of a world torn apart by conflict. The streets, once bustling with life, were eerily quiet, save for the ominous sound of boots marching in unison, the unmistakable rhythm of an occupying force. The war had come to the village, not with the thunderous violence of artillery, but with the slow, creeping march of soldiers who had conquered not just the land, but the hearts and minds of the people. The enemy had taken control, and the inhabitants were left to navigate a landscape that had become foreign to them, even though it was their own. For the adults, it was a grim reality that they had learned to endure, though they lived in constant fear of reprisals, punishment, and the ever-present possibility of losing everything. The children, however, had no such coping mechanisms. They could not understand the intricacies of politics or the shifting tides of war. All they knew was the world around them had become a place where safety and security had vanished, replaced by a constant undercurrent of terror. For the children, the nights were the hardest. The oppressive weight of fear clung to them like a thick fog, suffocating their sleep and keeping them wide-eyed and trembling under worn-out blankets. When the sun set and the shadows of the evening stretched long across the village, the air would grow thick with an uneasy silence. It was in these hours that the true nature of the occupation was most felt. It was not the bombs that fell with explosive force, nor the occasional skirmish that seemed to happen at a distance, but the subtle terror that crept into every crevice of their lives. The children, young as they were, had learned to fear the voices that rose in the distance, the harsh, clipped commands of soldiers, the angry shouting that accompanied every confrontation, and the rhythmic sound of boots marching down cobbled streets. Each night, they lay awake, listening for these sounds, their bodies stiff with the anticipation of what might come next. Their sleep was no longer a time for dreams, but a space where their minds remained on high alert, straining to hear every footstep, every distant call, every creak of a door opening. In those dark hours, the children would huddle closer to their mothers, seeking comfort in the warmth of their embrace, even though they knew that this comfort was temporary, fleeting. The fear that hung in the air was not just the fear of the soldiers themselves, but of the unknown, of what might happen next, of who might be taken away in the night, or worse, who might never return. The children knew that they were powerless in this new world, and yet, they also knew that they were the ones most vulnerable to the brutality of the occupying forces. In their young minds, the idea of safety seemed like a distant memory, one that belonged to a time before the war, before the world had fractured beyond recognition. For the adults, there was a certain resignation that had settled into their bones. They had seen the horrors of war unfold before their eyes, had felt the heavy hand of oppression press down on them in ways both subtle and overt. They had learned to endure, to live in a constant state of vigilance, always anticipating the next command, the next intrusion, the next loss. But for the children, there was no such resignation. They had not yet learned how to carry the weight of the world on their shoulders. They had not yet learned how to mask their fear behind stoic faces. For them, the world was still a place of wonder, even in the midst of the chaos. But now, that wonder was slowly being replaced by a creeping dread, a deep and overwhelming fear of what the next day might bring. The children would often play in the alleys, their games now shaped by the constraints of their environment. Where once they had run freely, now they were cautious, always looking over their shoulders, always aware of the sound of boots in the distance. They would try to mimic the soldiers they saw in the streets, creating makeshift weapons from sticks and stones, pretending to be soldiers themselves, only to be interrupted by the sound of a soldier's voice commanding them to stop. There was no joy in these games, no laughter in the air. The games had become hollow, as though even the act of pretending was no longer a means of escape, but a painful reminder of the reality they had been thrust into. Yet, despite the fear and the uncertainty that ruled their lives, there were moments, brief, fleeting moments, where the children could still taste the sweetness of innocence. They would find solace in the small things: a flower blooming in the cracks of a ruined wall, the sound of a bird singing despite the war raging around it, the brief respite when a mother's arms would envelope them in warmth and security. These were the fragments of peace that the children clung to, small enough to fit in the palm of their hands, but large enough to offer some semblance of hope in a world that seemed devoid of it. In the village, there was a small community of children who had formed bonds despite the occupation. They had learned to rely on one another, sharing what little they had and supporting each other through the long nights. They would gather in the corners of abandoned buildings or under the cover of overgrown trees, exchanging stories of the past and dreams of a future that seemed impossible. In these secret gatherings, they would whisper of freedom, of a time when the soldiers would be gone and the world would be safe again. But these stories were not just about the desire for liberation, they were about the longing for normalcy, for the return of a life that had been stripped away by the brutal forces of war. They spoke of days when the air would no longer be thick with the sound of marching boots and the village would no longer be a shadow of its former self. As the war raged on, the children's understanding of the world around them continued to shift. They began to recognize that the soldiers they saw in the streets were not simply faceless figures in uniforms, but human beings, some of whom looked just as lost and weary as they felt. The soldiers' eyes, though hard and unyielding, also carried traces of sorrow, of a weight that seemed to mirror their own. In their small minds, the children began to understand that war was not a simple matter of good and evil, of right and wrong. It was a tangled web of survival, of fear, of loss, and of survival at any cost. And in that web, the children found themselves caught, struggling to find their place in a world that had lost its way. Yet, despite the terror, despite the fear that gripped them each night, there was a glimmer of hope, a small, stubborn flame that refused to be snuffed out. The children, in their innocence and purity, continued to believe that things could be different. They continued to dream of a world where they could play freely again, where they could laugh and run without the fear of what might come next. It was this hope, fragile and fleeting though it was, that sustained them in the darkest hours, that kept them clinging to the memory of a world that once was and a future that, in their hearts, they still believed was possible. In the depths of their fear, the children had become the silent witnesses to the unraveling of the world around them. But even in the face of overwhelming darkness, they had not yet lost their capacity to dream, to hope, to believe in a tomorrow where the sun might shine once more. The village, though broken and scarred by war, had not yet been entirely consumed by its horrors. And as long as the children held onto that flicker of hope, there was a chance, however small, that the darkness might one day give way to light. The war, with its slow but inevitable march, had already stripped the village of its vibrancy, leaving only the remnants of what once was. What had been a peaceful, rustic community nestled in a quiet valley, surrounded by green pastures and clear streams, was now a mere shadow of itself. The laughter of children had long since faded, replaced by the sharp, cold sounds of military boots marching down every street, their rhythm a constant reminder that nothing would ever be the same. The once open skies were often filled with the dark plumes of smoke rising from nearby bombings, a grim reflection of the devastation happening just beyond the horizon. The war had not only ravaged the land but had irreparably altered the lives of those who called this village home. For the children, the transformation was perhaps the most stark. The world they had once known, one of freedom, of running barefoot through sun-dappled meadows, of playing tag with laughter echoing in the breeze, was gone. In its place was an environment where every sound carried the potential for fear, and every shadow seemed to threaten a new nightmare. The fear was inescapable, weaving itself into the very fabric of their lives. It wasn't just the fear of bombings or the fear of soldiers marching through the streets, though those were ever present. It was the fear of the unknown, the unsettling sense that the world was no longer a place where they could simply be children. In the village, there were no longer games of hide and seek or makeshift carts being pulled through the cobbled streets. The children's world had become one of stillness, of waiting, and of watching as their parents struggled to maintain some semblance of normalcy in a time when normality had been reduced to an impossible dream. The adults did their best to shield the children from the worst of it, but the children could sense it. They saw the worried expressions on their parents' faces when they thought no one was looking, the quick glances exchanged when soldiers passed through their streets, the whispered conversations about who was safe and who had been taken away. The children could feel the anxiety that clung to the air, thick and palpable, like a storm waiting to break. It was not just the soldiers who instilled fear in the children. The very presence of the war, with its constant violence and unpredictability, had fractured the safety that had once defined their world. Every day felt like a waiting game, waiting for the next air raid, waiting for the next violent outburst, waiting for the next loss. The walls of the homes, once comforting and familiar, now seemed to close in on them. At night, when the air was thick with the hum of distant artillery and the cries of distant victims, the children could not sleep. There were no more comforting bedtime stories, no more lullabies to chase away the darkness. Instead, the darkness became a thing to fear, something that reached into their hearts and planted seeds of terror that would grow deeper with each passing day. In the hours between dusk and dawn, the children's minds would race. They would lie in their narrow beds, their little hearts pounding, their bodies stiff with fear, knowing that the sound of shouting could pierce the silence at any moment. They knew the shouting too well, the sharp, guttural orders barked by the soldiers, the commands given with the weight of authority. They had heard those orders countless times, had seen the soldiers drag men and women from their homes, their faces twisted with fear and confusion. The children knew better than to ask questions. They had learned early that in a world ruled by fear, it was safer to remain silent. But silence, as it turned out, was its own kind of prison. The children, trapped in a world that was no longer theirs to control, began to turn inward, their minds retreating into places where the echoes of fear and the sounds of war could not reach. Their innocence, once a shield against the cruelties of life, began to crumble as they were exposed to the harsh realities of the world around them. They no longer played without worry. Instead, they sat in corners of rooms, huddled together, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. The games of childhood seemed distant, irrelevant in a world where survival had become the priority. Their toys, once treasured possessions, now lay forgotten in the dust. There was no joy to be found in these things anymore. Instead, the children clung to each other, seeking comfort in the presence of those who shared their terror. At times, the children would attempt to play, but their games were no longer games. They would reenact scenes from the war, mimicking the movements of the soldiers they saw in the streets, creating makeshift weapons from branches and stones. But there was no joy in these imitations. Instead, it was as if the children were trying to understand a world that had no place for them. They tried to make sense of it, to bring order to the chaos that surrounded them, but the war did not make sense. It did not care about their innocence or their desire for normalcy. It simply moved forward, relentless and indifferent. In moments when the children were alone, they would find themselves looking out of windows at the soldiers who passed by, their faces often hard, their expressions cold and distant. The soldiers, for the most part, ignored the children, too absorbed in their own duties to acknowledge them. But sometimes, the children would catch glimpses of something else in the soldiers' eyes, something that made them pause. There was, perhaps, a trace of sadness in those eyes, a flicker of something that suggested the soldiers were not simply machines of war, but human beings caught in the same storm. The children didn't understand it fully, but they could feel it, the recognition that the soldiers, like them, were also trapped in a world they hadn't created, forced to play roles they hadn't chosen. The fear of the soldiers was one thing, but the fear of the unknown was something altogether different. The children would often ask their parents about the future, about what would happen when the war ended. But their questions were always met with vague reassurances, promises of safety, and reminders that the war would eventually come to an end. Yet the children, despite their young age, could feel the weight of uncertainty pressing down on them. They could feel the tension in the air, the uneasy stillness that hung over everything, as if everyone were waiting for something that none of them could predict or control. In the hours after the children's bedtime, when the village was shrouded in darkness, the fear would manifest in strange ways. It wasn't just the nightmares that haunted the children's dreams, though those were plenty. It was the silence itself that became unnerving, an empty space that seemed to stretch on forever. In that silence, every footstep became a potential threat, every distant sound an omen of what was to come. The children's minds would race, and in the quiet of the night, they would imagine all sorts of terrible things, things that were perhaps not even real, but felt as though they were. In the absence of certainty, fear filled the void, and the children were left to confront a world that seemed far too big and too dangerous for them to navigate alone. Yet, despite the overwhelming weight of fear that surrounded them, there were still moments of connection, small sparks of human warmth that the children clung to in the darkness. They would find solace in their families, mothers who whispered comforting words, fathers who held them close, trying to shield them from the worst of it, even though they knew there was little they could do to protect them. The love that existed within the family was a thread that held everything together, offering a sense of security amidst the chaos. But that love, too, was tinged with sadness, for the parents knew that no matter how hard they tried, they could not shield their children from the horrors that surrounded them. The children's innocence, though deeply scarred by the war, had not been entirely erased. In those brief moments of quiet, when the world seemed to pause, they would still dream of a different life, one where they could be children again. They would dream of a time when the war would be over, when the soldiers would leave, and when they could once again run freely through the meadows. These dreams, though fragile and fleeting, were the last vestiges of their former lives, the last remnants of a world they had lost. And it was in these moments, in the quiet spaces between the terror, that the children clung to the hope that one day, their world would be whole again. The night had fallen, and with it, the village lay blanketed in an oppressive silence, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery and the faint, ever-present hum of war. In the small homes scattered across the village, the children lay awake, their eyes wide and unblinking as they listened to the sounds of the world that had become their new reality. Their bodies were stiff, as though bracing themselves for the next wave of terror, the next unknown that would come crashing through their fragile sense of safety. The fear had become a constant companion, an invisible weight pressing down on them, leaving them little room for anything else. For weeks, the village had been under occupation, and the children, who had once known only innocence and joy, had been thrust into a world of darkness and confusion. They could no longer remember a time when they had played freely, without fear, without the weight of the world upon them. The daily rhythms of their existence had been replaced by a strange, uneasy quiet, punctuated by the sharp, commanding voices of the soldiers and the constant shuffle of boots marching through their streets. Every day felt like an eternity, each hour stretching longer than the last as the children grew more accustomed to living in the shadow of fear. But this night, something was different. There was a subtle change in the air, a shift in the way the world seemed to hold its breath. The children, lying in the darkness of their homes, could feel it, though they didn't fully understand what it meant. It was as though something had shifted in the very fabric of their lives, a disturbance in the rhythm of their world that they could not name. In the distance, there was a faint sound, a noise that, at first, seemed like just another echo in the endless background of war. But it wasn't. It was something different. It was the sound of footsteps. British footsteps. The children, their hearts already heavy with fear, froze. It was as though the very sound of those footsteps reverberated through their bones, striking a chord deep within them. The occupying forces had been German soldiers, men who had ruled their village with an iron fist, who had instilled fear in every corner, in every face. But now, these were different footsteps. These were foreign footsteps, and for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, the children felt something shift in the pit of their stomachs. Was this it? Was this the liberation they had been told to expect, the end of the nightmare that had dominated their lives for so long? The sound grew louder, drawing closer. The children, who had once lived in constant dread of the soldiers who patrolled their streets, now found themselves caught in a strange, unexpected moment of hope. The sound of the British soldiers' boots on the cobbled streets seemed to promise something different, something that was not wrapped in the harshness and cruelty that the children had come to associate with the enemy. But there was also fear. The children had been taught to fear the soldiers, to view them as the harbingers of violence, as figures to be avoided at all costs. Could these new soldiers be the same? Could they bring the same destruction and suffering? As the footsteps grew nearer, The children pressed themselves against the walls, their breath held in fear and anticipation. They listened carefully, trying to make out the shapes and sounds of the soldiers approaching, their minds racing with questions that had no answers. Would the soldiers be kind? Would they bring peace, or would they bring more violence? The children had never before encountered soldiers who were not enemies, who were not figures of terror, and they had no way of knowing what to expect from these newcomers. The night seemed to stretch on forever, and the footsteps grew louder still, now unmistakable. And then, at last, the soldiers appeared. But what the children saw before them was nothing like what they had imagined. These were not the cold, distant faces of the soldiers who had occupied their village for so long. These were men, tired and ragged from the long march, their faces drawn and weary, but still somehow human. And as they entered the village, their eyes did not burn with the anger and hatred the children had come to associate with soldiers. Instead, their eyes were soft, almost compassionate, as though they were seeing the village for the first time, taking in the quiet desperation that clung to the air. The children watched from behind curtains, from the cracks in doors, as the soldiers moved through the streets. They moved slowly, carefully, as though they were trying to disturb as little as possible. They did not shout, did not bark orders at the villagers. Instead, they spoke softly, their voices barely more than whispers, as if they were trying not to break the fragile peace that had settled over the town. The soldiers seemed to be aware of the presence of the children, for they paused at doorways, bending down slightly, their eyes scanning the darkened homes as if searching for some sign of life. And then, one by one, the soldiers began to do something that none of the children had ever expected. They offered kindness. The first soldier to approach a house had paused at the doorway of a small home where a young girl and her brother hid in the shadows. They had been told to remain quiet, to make no noise, and to stay out of sight. The soldier, noticing the faint movement inside the window, smiled softly and knelt down, his tired eyes meeting the children's wide, fearful ones. He didn't speak, not at first, but he slowly extended his hand, offering something wrapped in cloth. The children, hesitant and unsure, slowly approached, their fear mixed with curiosity. It was chocolate. Something so small, so simple, but in that moment, it felt like a gift from another world. One that was filled not with death and destruction, but with humanity. The children took the chocolate, their small hands trembling. It was the first time in what seemed like forever that they had received something not born from the brutality of war, but from something softer, something warmer. The soldier, seeing their wide eyes, nodded slowly, and in the most gentle voice, said, "It's going to be all right." And just like that, everything shifted. The children had known only one reality, a world where every soldier was an enemy, where every stranger was a potential threat. But now, as they held the chocolate in their hands, as they saw the kindness in the soldiers' eyes, a new reality began to form before them. The world was not black and white, not divided into simply good and evil, enemy and ally. This soldier, this man who had marched into their village with the same boots that had once instilled fear in their hearts, was offering them something that none of the others had ever given, a glimpse of hope. The night passed quietly, and the footsteps of the soldiers slowly faded as they moved through the village, but the children could not forget what had happened. For the first time in a long while, they felt the faintest stirrings of trust, of something they had lost somewhere in the darkness of war. They had seen kindness where they had expected cruelty, and in that moment, something profound shifted within them. The soldiers were not just invaders, they were people, too. And perhaps, just perhaps, the world they had known, one filled with terror and suffering, was not the only world that existed. As the British soldiers continued to advance through the village, offering small gestures of kindness, helping the elderly with their bags, checking in on the frightened families hiding in their homes, and offering food to the hungry, the children began to notice the change in the air. What had been a place of fear was slowly beginning to transform into a place of possibility. The children, who had once cowered in fear at the thought of soldiers, now began to see them in a different light. These were not monsters. They were men who had seen horrors of their own, who had come to this place not to destroy, but to end the suffering. And in their quiet acts of compassion, they were offering a glimpse of something the children had thought lost forever, a future where kindness might still exist. The fear that had once gripped the children's hearts began to loosen its hold. The footsteps they had once dreaded were now steps that promised something better. Something that, for the first time in years, felt like hope. And in that hope, something began to change within them. They were no longer the terrified children who had cowered in corners, waiting for the next round of terror. They were beginning to believe, just for a moment, that the world could be different. And in that belief, they found something more powerful than fear, the strength to look at the world with new eyes, eyes that could see not just the soldiers of war, but the possibility of a future where kindness, however small, could change everything. As the days passed, the presence of the British soldiers began to alter the rhythm of life in the village in ways that no one had expected. What began as a tentative, almost hesitant arrival of foreign troops turned into something far more profound. The soldiers, who had initially appeared as distant figures of authority, became human in the eyes of the villagers, especially in the eyes of the children who had been so deeply scarred by fear. The constant drumbeat of war that had surrounded them for so long had not been silenced, but something had shifted. Where there had been only the cold sound of boots marching in step with violence, now there was something new, something unfamiliar but undeniably powerful: kindness. The first acts of compassion had been small, subtle gestures that could easily have been dismissed as incidental. A soldier offering a chocolate bar to a frightened child, a comforting word whispered to an anxious mother, a hand reaching down to help an elderly man to his feet. These were not grand gestures of salvation, but simple moments of connection that made the villagers question what they had believed for so long. The soldiers, once feared as the embodiment of their torment, were now showing them a different side, one that spoke not of violence, but of shared humanity. Slowly, the walls that had been built between the occupiers and the occupied began to erode. For the children, the transformation was the most striking. They had been raised in a world where soldiers were enemies, where every uniform was a symbol of oppression. The presence of the British soldiers was, at first, a terrifying reminder of the war that had upended their lives. But as the days wore on, they began to witness small miracles. The soldiers didn't just occupy their village, they began to engage with it. They began to speak to the children, not with orders or threats, but with gentle encouragement. They asked about their families, about their lives before the war. In the eyes of these soldiers, the children could see not just soldiers at war, but men who had experienced loss themselves, men who knew what it meant to be afraid, men who understood the weight of living through a conflict that had claimed everything. It wasn't that the soldiers' presence had erased the pain, but it began to shift how the children understood the world. No longer did they see everything as black and white, as simply good versus evil. Their young minds, which had been filled with confusion and fear, began to open to the possibility that people were not defined solely by their uniforms, nor by the sides they fought for. They began to understand that even in the midst of violence, even in the midst of destruction, there was room for something else. There was room for kindness, for tenderness, for the human instinct to reach out to one another even when the world was burning around them. It wasn't long before these small acts of compassion became more frequent. Soldiers began to take time out of their day to check on the families living in the village. They would knock gently on doors, asking if there was anything the villagers needed. They would sit with the elderly, listening to their stories of days before the war, offering a silent solidarity that spoke louder than any words could. They would stop and talk to the children, sharing small toys or simple pleasures, a game of catch, a moment of laughter, a shared smile. These moments, though fleeting, began to paint a different picture of what the soldiers were, what they represented. They were not simply the instruments of the occupation, the enforcers of a cruel regime. They were people. They were fathers, brothers, sons. They had come to liberate the village, yes, but they had also come to offer something more, a sense of humanity that the war had tried to steal from everyone it touched. For the adults in the village, the presence of the British soldiers was still complicated. They had witnessed firsthand the brutality of war, and their scars, both visible and invisible, ran deep. Many of them still carried the heavy weight of their experiences. They had lost family members, friends, neighbors. They had watched their homes be destroyed, their lives upended. For them, the presence of the soldiers brought mixed emotions. They were grateful for the liberation, for the hope of an end to the occupation, but they also carried the burden of suspicion. How could they trust these soldiers, these men who had come from another land, wearing the same uniforms as the oppressors who had ruled their lives for so long? The memories of the past were not easily erased, and there was a lingering fear that even these soldiers, who had shown them kindness, could turn into something else at any moment. But as the days went on, even the adults began to witness the humanity in the soldiers' actions. They saw how the soldiers interacted with their children, how they treated the elderly with respect, how they offered what little they had to share. The soldiers had not come to simply conquer, they had come to rebuild, to offer hope, to restore some sense of dignity to a people who had been broken. And in doing so, they had begun to shift the perception of what it meant to be an enemy. The lines between friend and foe, ally and adversary, began to blur. The villagers began to see that even in the most unlikely of places, amidst the ruins of war, there could be kindness. They began to understand that liberation did not come just with the cessation of violence, but through the restoration of something far deeper, the restoration of faith in humanity. It was in the quiet, everyday interactions that the soldiers made their most lasting impact. The children, once so terrified of the soldiers, began to approach them with tentative smiles. They would ask questions that were once unthinkable, questions about the world beyond their village, about life before the war. The soldiers, ever patient, would answer them kindly, sharing stories of their own homes, of their own lives, of the world they came from. The children, who had known nothing but the harsh realities of war, were given a glimpse of a different world, a world where children could play without fear, where laughter wasn't drowned out by explosions. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was enough to plant a seed of hope in their hearts, a hope that they had not dared to feel in so long. The soldiers, through their small acts of kindness, had begun to teach the children that not all was lost, that there was still room for compassion, even in the darkest of times. The village, which had once been a place of quiet suffering, began to change. It wasn't just the arrival of the British soldiers that had caused this transformation, it was the way they had chosen to act, the way they had chosen to interact with the people they had come to liberate. They had not imposed their will through force or violence, as the previous occupiers had done. Instead, they had offered something different, something that was infinitely more powerful: kindness. The soldiers had not come to conquer the people of the village, they had come to heal the wounds that war had inflicted. They had come to remind the villagers, and the children especially, that even in the most brutal of circumstances, there was always the possibility of something better. The acts of kindness did not go unnoticed. Slowly, word spread throughout the village. The soldiers who had once been feared as the enemy were now seen in a different light. The villagers, who had once hidden in fear, now began to emerge from their homes, their faces softening with cautious hope. They saw in the soldiers not just liberators, but fellow human beings who had come to offer them something more than just a reprieve from oppression. They had come to offer a glimpse of the humanity that had been lost amidst the chaos of war. It was this gift, small as it was, that began to change the very fabric of the village. Where there had once been division, there was now the possibility of unity. Where there had once been fear, there was now the hope for peace. For the children, the transformation was the most profound. They had known only fear and uncertainty, but now, as they walked the streets with the soldiers, as they received small gifts of kindness and experienced moments of compassion, they began to believe in something else. They began to believe in a future where kindness could triumph over violence, where love could overcome hatred. And it was in that belief that the village, once torn apart by war, began to heal. The children, with their newfound hope, were the first to recognize that the world they had known, the world of war and fear, was not the only world that existed. There was another world, a world that was still being built, a world where the footsteps of soldiers no longer brought terror, but the promise of something better.